Hey everyone, Professor Davis here, and I just wanted to spend a little bit more time in this genetics set of videos and talk to you a little bit more about human genetic disorders. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of them as we've gone through part 1 and part 2, but here we're going to go into a little more detail. So we talked about how kerotyping is where we could map out the chromosomes. We also see genetic screening tests are available to help diagnose some genetic disorders, and kerotyping is one of those tests. The procedures used to obtain a specimen to do these tests, especially when the child is in utero, is going to be an amniocentesis or a chronic villi sampling. Now, with this there are some complications that can happen with these tests, and so there's actually a better test for early detection that they use with the mother's blood. However, it's not 100%, and so they have to then potentially use these tests if there's a chance of certain kinds of genetic disorders, and they want to maybe have a clearer picture of the chances or the probability. You can also test the embryo and the egg ahead of time before they are implanted. This is going to be seen mostly with like in vitro treatments where they can actually test it before they implant that inside of the woman to see if it has some genetic disorders prior to continued in that sense of pregnancy. Now, a lot of these disorders are going to be talked about here. We're going to talk first about some where the chromosome number is abnormal. We'll also talk about some where the chromosome may be deleted or inverted, or there could be repeats. And then we're also going to hit on some disorders, whether they're dominant or recessive, in the sense of where if it's just one allele that's mutated, one trait that's mutated. And so this first little part's going to look at the non-disjunction that occurs in meiosis 1 and 2. And this is where the chromosome number is going to be abnormal. And so the chromosomes are supposed to separate in anaphase, where one goes into each direction. But in this case, non-disjunction happens where the whole chromosome, both sets go to one egg or sperm, and the other egg or sperm is left empty for that trait. And so if this egg has, or this sperm has 2 of the chromosomes and it's fertilized, now it has 3 of that chromosome. And on the other hand, if the egg and sperm has 0 of those chromosomes, if it's fertilized, it only has 1. So there are some autosomal abnormalities that can happen, and these are the 22 chromosomes pairs that are not sex-linked. The only ones that you can see that will cause and where it's a viable pregnancy would be trisomies, where you get 3 copies of a chromosome. So some of the more common ones are going to be Down syndrome, which is a trisomy 21, chromosome 21, Pedigree syndrome, which is trisomy 13, and Edwards syndrome, which is a trisomy 18. There's also a trisomy when it comes to the sex chromosomes. And so this is where there's an XXY, and this is known as Kleinfelter Syndrome. And then there's only one monosomy that actually survives and is a viable pregnancy. In this monosomy, the individual gets one X, no other X or Y. So the little 0 here or O means they don't have anything there. And in this case, they get one X, and this is Turner's syndrome. Okay. And so we're going to take a little closer look as we go through each of these. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I just want to give you a little bit more information. Okay, so the first we want to look at is trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome. This is abnormality where there are 3 copies of chromosome 21, which you can see in this karyotype over here. We do see this is due to non-disjunction, but in 5% of the cases, it could be due to a translocation, where a piece of the chromosome broke off and moved somewhere where it shouldn't go. Most of the time, though, it's due to non-disjunction. It's spontaneous, which means that you don't have to have a family history of it for it to occur. Symptoms. What does a individual with Down syndrome maybe have to deal with symptom-wise? So there's some characteristics, and they can actually be detected in utero through ultrasound, some of these beforehand. One is excessive skin at the nape of the neck. So the back of the neck, there's going to be some excessive skin, and they can see this in an ultrasound. Flattened nose, where the nose is more flat. We also see that they'll have small ears, and their mouth will also be smaller, and they'll have what we would call upward slanted eyes. And so these are what gives them some of those physical characteristics that we recognize with Down syndrome. There's also going to be some mental and social characteristics that come with Down syndrome. They tend to have more impulsive behavior. They don't have that ability of kind of thinking things through. They're just more impulsive. They don't think necessarily before they act as much. They may have poor judgment, slow learning. So they may have a learning disability that comes into play where it's not going to be where they Can't learn at all. They just might be slower at it. And then they also have a short attention span. And this does relate a lot of times to their impulsive behavior and learning more slowly. We also see some other symptoms that can happen physically due to having this extra chromosome 21, is it could cause some heart defects. We see that they do develop dementia more often. They have a lot of gastrointestinal issues, hearing problems, sleep apnea, and underactive thyroid. Another one is that their chances of developing leukemia also increases for whatever reason. And so these are just some of the examples of some of the traits that are present with somebody that has trisomy 21. Now, they may not have all these traits. They may only have some of them. Some may be more severe than others, but this is the set of signs and symptoms that come with the Down syndrome. The next one's trisomy 13, which is known as Pedigrees syndrome. This is going to be a trisomy of chromosome 13, and more than 80% die within the first year if they have this trisomy. Okay, so you can see here in this karyotype, they have 3 chromosome 13s. This is again due to non-disjunction, and it could be due to a translocation mutation, but it's super rare on that case. And this happens in 1 out of every 10,000 newborns or births. Some symptoms, physical characteristics is the child could have a cleft lip, clenched hands, and all babies tend to have kind of clenched hands at first before they start to relax them, but these children don't have that ability. It's much to relax and grab onto things as well. Close set eyes, and sometimes their eyes can be so close together that they fuse into one, and this creates an issue. Polydactyly, which is extra fingers and toes. They may have scalp defects, skeletal abnormalities, small eyes, small head, and a small lower jaw. Mental and social characteristics. This one does have severe mental retardation as its mental social side. Other symptoms, they could develop hernias, they could have apnea, deafness, heart failure, seizures, and vision issues. So if you'll notice, a lot more of these things are more severe. They're not things that could potentially be addressed with surgeries and things like that. And so this is why the life expectancy of an individual with Pedigrees syndrome is not very long. The next one is trisomy 18 Edwards syndrome. This is an autosomal abnormality where they have 3 chromosome 18s that are present. 50% do not survive beyond the first week of life. And this is due to a non-disjunction. It could be, again, a translocation mutation. Physical characteristics, they also have clenched hands like we saw with Pedigrees. Their legs tend to be more crossed, and they are very tight in those muscles so that they don't want to uncross their legs very well. Their feet have rounded bottoms instead of flat bottoms. They tend to have lower set ears, small head, and jaw. Now, guys, having that smaller jaw in both cases with Pedigrees and Edwards can cause feeding issues, especially with latching, with like lactation, or also bottle feeding. Mental and social characteristics is that they do have a mental delay. Other symptoms, hernias, congenital heart disease, and kidney problems. So again, it depends on the severity of their heart issues, their kidney issues, whether they can eat well enough that's going to help with their potential survival rate. This one is switching gears a little bit and looking at the monosomy where they have one chromosome. This one's with one X. This is Turner syndrome, and it is only due to non-disjunction. Individuals with Turner syndrome are female, okay, because they do not have a Y. The X makes them female. Their physical characteristics, they tend to have a wide or webbed neck. So their neck is wider and kind of has like a web coming down from their ear to their shoulders, which makes it wider. They tend to be short in stature. They'll have more of a drooping eyelid. Mental and social characteristics, they don't really have any that show up as an issue for them. Okay, if they have learning disabilities and things like that, it's not really related to Turner syndrome. Other symptoms, though, is that they have infertility. Because they only have one X, they do not develop properly in the sense of puberty and creating enough hormones in order for the ability to produce egg happens, as well as half their eggs would have no X in them. They would have no sex chromosome in them, so that causes it to be a bigger issue with trying to get pregnant and that sort of thing. They also, because they don't produce enough hormone, they don't have periods. They tend to develop arthritis, diabetes. They do have some heart defects that could be present, kidney issues, and they do have to fight obesity a little more often. And so these are some of the potential symptoms with Turner's syndrome. The next one is Kleinfelter Syndrome. Kleinfelter Syndrome is also a sex chromosome issue where there's going to be an XXY, which means it's a trisomy. This happens in 1 out of every 500 to 1,000 births. And there's an increase in chance in this in women who are over the age of 35. Now, guys, this is true for almost any non-disjunction. And remember, I talked to you about when we were looking at the production of egg and sperm, that women are born with the amount of eggs they're having that they will have, and they're suspended in that meiosis. It causes an issue because when you're 35, that egg is also 35 and has been sitting there where things could go wrong during those 35 years. So the older you get, the higher the risk or chance of this kind of stuff with non-disjunction could happen. Symptoms include with physical characteristics, abnormal body proportions. So they have kind of odd body proportions when it comes to like their torso, their hips, their leg length, things like that. They tend to have more breast tissue due to the extra X. Okay, so they have a little more breast tissue that's present. They have less than normal body hair. And again, this is the counteraction between the testosterone and estrogen that's occurring in their body. And they tend to be tall in height. Social and mental characteristics, they do tend to have some more learning disabilities like dyslexia is more common, and they also deal with depression. And the depression side of it is because they are a little different. Their body proportions are different. The way that their muscle develops is different. And so if it's not diagnosed early, they tend to have some more of those body issues and depression that happens. Other symptoms, they could be infertile. Doesn't mean that they will, but it could cause some issues with that. They tend to have ADHD more often. Autoimmune disorders where their immune system attacks itself, lung disease, and they do develop osteoporosis more earlier and more often than other men do. And this again has to do with those estrogen levels. Now, treatment for this would be to counteract with extra testosterone. And so there are different ways that this can happen and be used. And guys, a lot of times people who have Turner syndrome or even Kleinfelter syndrome, a lot of people don't even know. Okay, they don't even realize they have that, or they may not know until later when they start to see a couple of other things come up where like, this doesn't seem quite normal. But treatments can allow them to live pretty relatively normal lives. If we switch gears a little bit, we're still looking at chromosomes if there's a problem with the chromosome, but in this case, this is where the chromosome structure is the issue, not the chromosome number. So this is due to like a gene mutation like deletion, translocation where it moves from one place to another, duplication where we have it duplicated, and then inversion where it broke off and it reattached upside down. And so one of the types of disorders that's a deletion disorder or syndrome is called Williams syndrome. This is a deletion of about 25 genes on chromosome 7. This happens in 1 out of every 10,000 births. And this is a spontaneous mutation. It's not caused by anything that the mother did or anything like that. It can just happen. Some symptoms with Williams syndrome is physical characteristics. They have small upward turned noses. They have a wider mouth, very full lips, small chin, and puffiness around their eyes. And because of this kind of look that they have based on the facial features, a lot of times this is known as Pixie Syndrome because they look like little pixies, like fairies in a sense, in their face. Mental and social characteristics are that they do have some learning disabilities. They are overly friendly. They do not have those kind of, and Down syndrome children have this too. They don't have that hesitation and that judgment with strangers and things like that. They kind of just look at the best in everybody, and they are very trusting and overly friendly, and that can be an issue with the safety of these children. They also tend to have ADD, but they have a very good affinity to music. They are very sensitive with their hearing, and this is probably why they can actually when they listen to music, they can pick out different instruments and things like that from an early age. Music tends to be something they're normally really good at. Mental and social characteristics, with that, it's really just the protection of that overly friendliness that's an issue for the most part. Other symptoms include heart and vessel problems could occur. They could have hypercalcemia, kidney problems, and those kidney problems a lot of times come from the hypercalcemia. This is excessive levels of minerals that can happen in the body, and so the kidneys are trying to help clean those out, and so because of that, they could have some issues. Hernias, and they do have more sensitive hearing. Not deafness, it's just more sensitive. Another deletion that we want to talk about is called cri du chat. Cri du chat is French for cry of the cat. This is a deletion of the short arm of chromosome 5. You can see it here where on chromosome 5, a little piece of it is missing. This is 1 out of every 50,000 births. It is more common in girls for whatever reason, but the cause is spontaneous, so it's not really related to males versus females, but we tend to see it more often in females based on the probabilities. Now with this, it is a deletion. It is cry of the cat, and the reason it gets that name is because when the child cries, they have a very high-pitched sound that sounds like a crying cat. Okay, so that's where the name comes from. Some physical characteristics: downward slanted eyes, slow growth. They'll have webbing between their fingers and toes, and so that just means the apoptosis in the skin between the fingers and toes didn't take place, and so they have some webbing that takes place there. Small head and jaw, and wider set eyes. Mental and social characteristics: there is some mental retardation that comes along with this. Other symptoms are motor development problems. Their cry is high-pitched, sounds like a cat, that's the name, and they tend to develop hernias more regularly. We've already talked a little bit about this, that translocation syndrome could be due to Down syndrome. This is where a portion of chromosome 14 is added to chromosome 21. This is a less common version of Down syndrome, but this is one that runs in a family line that you can actually detect. We could potentially map it out in a family tree, whereas most Down syndromes that are the trisomy are spontaneous and there's no family history of them. All right, so now I want to talk to you a little bit about patterns of inheritance. We can kind of map out inheritance in some cases through family lines, and we do this through pedigree charts. It's not actually like socially acceptable to put two individuals in there and like, hey, let's create a kid and see what happens type of thing. We don't like to do experiments like that. And so what we do is we use pedigree charts to determine how disorders are going to be passed down family lines. These pedigree charts can help us to determine if a disorder is what we call autosomal dominant, meaning that it can happen to both males and females equally, but it's on a dominant trait, one of those capital letters. We can also use it to help detect autosomal recessive disorders, again, affecting men and women equally, but it's going to be found in a recessive state where you have to have the two little letters to have the disorder. Or it could be X-linked recessive, which means that's going to affect males more often, and recessive means they have to have the abnormal trait, the recessive lowercase. And I'm going to kind of help you know how to recognize these based on a pedigree, okay? And I'm going to go through them a little bit to show you how to see how to detect them. So when we look at pedigree charts, family histories, there's a couple of things you should notice. We do see that we're going to use some symbols here. So a circle represents a female and a square represents a male. When a line is between a circle and a square, this means that they are mating. It doesn't necessarily mean they're married, but they're mating. If they have a line coming down with other circles or squares coming off of that, that means they have children. All right, so they've had children. And if the circle or square is colored in, this means they are affected with whatever disorder we're looking at. Okay, so with that, whatever disorder we're looking at, that's what we're seeing. Now here it's showing you some pedigrees where we have autosomal recessive versus autosomal dominant versus X-linked recessive. There's a couple of things that we want to look at. If it's autosomal recessive, this means it involves a recessive allele on a non-sex chromosome. And this means they have to have two of the little letters in order to be affected. And if you look here, you'll notice in this 3 generations that are located in this autosomal recessive, only 2 of the individuals out of the 3 generations are affected. So autosomal recessive disorders don't tend to pop up as often or be seen in a family tree as often. However, on the autosomal dominant side, this means that it's a dominant allele on a non-sex chromosome. You'll notice in this one, it did not skip any generations. There's somebody, at least one person affected every generation. And at the end, you see there's 3 in one generation that are affected. This means more individuals normally will have this because it can manifest both in the homozygous dominant, like big letter, or in the heterozygous where you have the big letter, little letter. The X-linked recessive is the other one that you normally see. This involves a dominant allele, but it's on the X chromosome. So you'll notice that the only 2 boxes or 2 shapes that are filled in are boxes. Squares, this tells you it affects males more than females. Now, females can be affected by this, but this means they have to get 2 recessive disorder genes from mom and then also from dad. X-linked dominant and Y-linked we're not going to talk much about because they're not very common, but they could still be viewed in a family type tree. All right, so when we look at autosomal recessive, this is where they have the two little letters. So little a is affected. These are going to be things like Tay Sachs, cystic fibrosis, and phenylketonuria or PKU. And we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. Autosomal dominant means they have big A, little a, or big A, big A. This is going to be something like Neurofibromastosis, Huntington's disease, or Achondroplasia. X-linked recessive disorders is going to be, again, affecting males more than females. This is Duchin's muscular dystrophy, hemophilia, and color blindness. So let's talk briefly about the ones that are autosomal recessive, and then I'm going to show you a pedigree on how to kind of determine if it's autosomal recessive. So Tay Sachs is a disease. It's a defective gene on chromosome 15. And it affects the protein that's found inside lysosomes. Now, if you recall from the cell video, lysosomes are the recyclers of the cell. They come in and they help clean up any debris. They recycle old parts. They help get rid of waste products. So if they're not able to do this, especially with fat starts to build up in the cells. And this is a really big problem when fat builds up in the nervous system, in the nervous cells. And because of this, it causes damage to the nervous system, causing the brain to start to die. And the child only lives to about age of 4. Tay Sachs is found because it is an autosomal recessive disorder. It is found in some communities, the Auschwitz Jewish community. Now with this, it has a lot to do with the Holocaust. They believe they only can marry other Jews. And a lot of times these marriages are arranged. So rabbis actually act as geneticists a little bit with this now. Tay Sachs is actually more common in this group because of the Holocaust, because they lost 6 million people. So in their big population of people, the gene pool used to be very deep. And so you'd see this disease occasionally. The problem is with the Holocaust, their gene pool, because they lost so many members of their community, it made it more shallow. So this is actually more common now in that community. Now, Tay Sachs is not only found in the Jewish community, it can be found in others, but we do see that it is more common there. Cystic fibrosis is another one. This is a defect in the gene that causes the body to produce a thick, sticky mucus. So it makes the mucus that is produced by the body a lot thicker and a lot stickier. And because of this, it causes a lot of problems in the respiratory system and the digestive system. The average lifespan of somebody with cystic fibrosis is 37 years old, and that is with modern medicine, guys. So this is one of those that, yeah, they're living longer than they used to, but their life expectancy is still not very long. With cystic fibrosis, we do find that this is more common in the Caucasian community. This gene, being a recessive gene, actually was an advantage if you were a carrier, not if you had cystic fibrosis, but if you were a carrier of this trait, say you were big A, little a, and you carried the little a for cystic fibrosis, you had an advantage against dysentery and cholera, which were two major killers, especially in like the Middle Ages of European people. And so this is why Caucasians tend to have this more often in their lines. The next one is phenylketonuria. This is PKU for short. This is where the child is missing, or the individual is missing, an enzyme that breaks down the amino acid phenylalanine. And the amino acid builds up and causes damage to the nervous system. However, this is one that is actually treatable. Okay, so Tay Sachs and cystic fibrosis, we can help in a way, but there's not a whole lot we can do with that for them. But PKU, we can. If it's caught early, we can prevent any of that damage by giving them a special diet to follow. This means that the baby may have to be on a special formula. And when they get older, they have to avoid foods that have phenylalanine in it. As long as they do that, then they live a normal, healthy life. Now, guys, PKU is tested for in kids. You have to actually, the child, when they're born, they get a PKU test. They take some blood from their heel. And then a couple of weeks after their birth, normally 2, they have to have this test again. Okay. And again, it's the whole idea of making sure that they don't have it, and you want to try to prevent it. In the state of Texas, if you do not get the second PKU test, you could actually be charged with neglect and child abuse, because you are choosing not to help your baby by finding out if they have this in order to protect them. And if you don't, if they do have it and you don't find out because you don't get the test done, they would die. Okay, because ultimately this causes damage to the nervous system to where the baby dies from PKU. All right, and so this one is completely preventable. As long as you know they have it, you can make sure that they don't eat those particular products that have the phenylalanine in it, at least in not large amounts. Okay, so these are autosomal recessive. Autosomal dominant, on the other hand, are going to be where they have the capital letter. So that could be big A, or big A, little a. Example here is Neurofibromastosis. This causes tumors to grow in the nervous system. These tumors can become cancerous, and that's where the problem lies. As cells grow uncontrollably, there's a higher chance that they will become cancerous. Treatment involves removing the nodules or tumors through surgery and then doing chemotherapy and radiation. Depending on which nerves are affected, they could have some side effects based on having sensory issues or motor issues as well. Huntington's disease is another one. This is a genetic defect on chromosome 4. This is where they get a duplication of the CAG sequence. So it goes like CAG, and then you get another CAG and another CAG. It's a duplication that occurs. The problem with this one is you don't develop symptoms until later in life, in your late 30s or 40s. Normally, people are done having kids at this point, which means if you have this, you've passed it on to your kids in higher ways than if you have a recessive disorder. This disease then gets progressively worse until finally the individual is more like an infant. They no longer can talk, they can't feed themselves, they can't walk, they lose the ability to just live life, period. The last one here is achondroplasia. Oh, and with Huntington's disease, the major complication with this is suicide. You're thinking, oh, complication. Most people who commit suicide with this, they have actually helped take care of a parent or saw what their parent went through, and they are choosing not to go through that. And so that's where that comes in with Huntington's disease. Achondroplasia is the most common form of dwarfism, and it is a dominant disorder, believe it or not, where they have either the big A, little a, or two big A's. It can be passed down, or it could also be a spontaneous mutation that occurs. This is a type of dwarfism where they have a normal sized torso, but they have shorter limbs. Okay, so their torso is a normal sized person, but their limbs are shorter. Okay, and so this is a type of dwarfism. On the X-linked recessive side, we have color blindness. Color blindness here is talking about red-green color blindness. It is not very common disorder, but males inherit it from their mothers, and females must inherit it from a recessive gene from both mom and dad. So this means mom has to at least be a carrier of this color blindness, and dad has to be colorblind in order for a female to get this. Another type of X-linked recessive is Duchin's muscular dystrophy. This is a defect in the gene of dystrophin, which is the main protein in your muscles. This starts to break down, and your muscles replace this protein with fat, but fat does not function the same way as proteins do in your muscles. So this weakens the muscle. It advances very quickly, and the life expectancy of this type of muscular dystrophy is 25 years of age. And the reason being, guys, is that one of the main muscles that helps you breathe is your diaphragm, and that skeletal muscle, as it starts to break down, they have breathing issues, and they've got respiratory problems, which puts them at higher risk for infections and having to be put on ventilators. The last one here is hemophilia. This is a defective gene for factor 8. That V with the 3 lines means Roman numeral 8, and also could be factor 9. So the 1X means 9 Roman numerals, and these are required for proper blood clotting. So hemophilia is a bleeding disorder. So when you cut yourself and you go to stop bleeding, it creates kind of that gooey mesh on the wound. Okay, that's a blood clot. If you remove it, you start bleeding again. People with hemophilia, they don't make that blood clot, because in order for a blood clot to happen, it's like a domino effect. You have to set those dominoes up, and when you knock them over, one knocks over the next one, and so on. And what happens with hemophilia is one of the dominoes has been taken out, and it won't continue that process. It stops. And so it causes them to be what we consider free bleeders. Hemophilia can be dangerous because those individuals can bleed out from even simple injuries that could occur. All right. So here is a pedigree. And so if we take a look at this, we have a male who has the disorder shown in generation 1. We have, if we look at generation 2, we have 3 individuals in generation 2. And in generation 3, we have 1 individual who has it. Now, if you'll notice, the 1 individual who has it has a parent who has it from generation 2. Okay. Now, if you'll notice, it did not skip a generation. Since it did not skip a generation, this is more than likely an autosomal dominant disorder. Okay. So now that we know that it's dominant, let's look at generation 1 and let's look at individual 2. So if we look at individual 2, you know he has to have at least 1 big letter because he has the disorder. How do we determine what the second letter is we look at his kids. Since some of his kids have the disorder, but others do not, because you have to look at the lines coming down. Okay, he ended up having 6 kids. 3 of the 6 had the disorder. Since 3 of them did not, this means he had to be a carrier of the normal trait. So individual 2, generation 1 was big A, little a. Okay. So now let's look at generation 2, individual 3. And generation 2, individual 3, he is normal. He's not colored in. And since he's normal, this is going to mean that he is little a, little a. Okay. This is a dominant disorder, so he does not have the big letter. If we look at generation 2, individual 1, we know they have to have a big A. But again, if you look at her kids, 2 of her kids do not have it, which means she is also a carrier, big A, little a. So she has the capital letter, but she carries the recessive trait. If you go to generation 3, individual 3, okay, we know they have the disorder. She's got it. So we know they have a big A. But we do not know, well, technically we do, but we don't know for sure if she is big A, little a, or big A, until she has children. However, guys, since her dad was normal, there's a good chance she's big A, little a. The problem is the next generation would give us the for sure clue to what she is. Okay. And so if you'll notice here, there's no X's or Y's present because it doesn't matter if they were male or female. So guys, one thing when we look at dominant pedigrees, multiple generations show the trait. See how all 3 generations show that they have the trait. The trait can be passed on by both fathers and mothers, and men and women are equally likely to show the trait. Okay, there's an equal chance. It's not sex dependent. Okay, so this one was dominant. All right, here's another one. All right, again, you're noticing that there is a set where pretty much every generation is hit here. Okay, but if you'll notice, some of the generations were skipped based on the fact that you're looking at people who married in. So if you especially look at this idea of generation 1, individual 1 and 2, they pass it on. But if you look at generation 2, 6, 7, and 8 are their kids, and those kids were normal. The problem is that individual 5 who married in brought the trait. Okay. And so when we look at this one, because we also have equal male and female represented that have the disorder, this is a recessive disorder. Okay. And I'm going to go into more detail of why that is in a minute. But since we know it's a recessive disorder, let's find out what each generation is. Okay. In these individuals. So generation 1, individual 1 is colored in. If this is a recessive disorder, this means they have to have both little letters. So if they're colored in, they have to be little a, little a. Okay. So generation 1, individual 1 is little a, little a. Okay. Now let's look at generation 2, individual 8. Okay. Generation 2, individual 8. This person is normal. This means they have to have at least 1 big A. But guys, if you look up at who her dad was individual 1 from generation 1, which means that she got 1 little a from him. Also, if you look at one of her kids is affected. So when we look at generation 2, individual 8, she is big A, little a. Look at generation 2, individual 11. This person is colored in. We don't know any of their history besides their children. But if you notice, because their husband also is colored in, all their kids are colored in. This means the only thing that she could pass on and what he could pass on to their children was little a, little a. which means generation 3, individual 19, is also little a, little a. So some little things to help us see if it's recessive. This trait may appear among siblings, but not their parents and or their children. The trait can be passed on by both mothers and fathers, and men and women are equally likely to show the trait. So guys, if you look here, this is why people 6, 7, and 8 in this in generation 2 are so important, because the parent had it, but the kids 6, 7, and 8 did not, but the grandkids 13 and 17 did. Okay, and so you can see that it kind of could skip a generation in some cases. Not always, but it could. Okay, and so this is what we see with autosomal recessive. It could stay hidden. All right, so process of elimination, what's left? We've already done autosomal dominant. We've already done autosomal recessive. Well, this leaves sex-linked. Now, guys, one thing about sex-linked is, if you'll notice, there are more males affected than females. So this is part of it. More males are affected than females. But let's look at this. You have generation 1, individual 1. They have the disorder. However, because this is sex-linked, you have to show if they are XX or if they're XY. Since this is a circle, this is a female, so this is XX. Since she has it, this is going to be X little a, X little a. She has the disorder. Okay. Now, if you'll notice, the next generation, all of her sons have it, which makes sense because she gives the X and the dad gives the Y. So let's look at generation 2, individual 4. Generation 2, individual 4 is a circle, so she is XX. However, she is normal. She has at least one big A. But she got one little a from her mom, and you'll also notice that one of her sons was affected. So she is X big A, X little a. Individual or generation 2, individual 11. Oh, that's marked wrong. This is generation 3, individual 11. Sorry about that typo. But if you look at generation 3, individual 11, this is a male. Okay, because it's a square. So he is XY. And since he's not colored in, he has a big letter. So X big A, Y. But let's go over here and look at his cousin, which would be generation 3, individual 15, also a male, XY. However, since he is colored in, he's X little a, Y. So some kind of hints for sex-linked is males with the trait are shown to be more strongly than heterozygous females. They show it more strongly. The trait cannot be passed from father to son. If you notice, none of the fathers who had it passed it to their kids, unless the mother also had it. A male with the trait passes the gene on to all his daughters. Okay, and so if the male has it, he definitely passes it on to his daughters. All right, and so these are just some little tricks to kind of look at. So miscellaneous, guys, there's some incomplete dominant disorder I want to talk to you about, which is sickle cell disease. Sickle cell is going to be where a particular trait is not expressed completely. If you have sickle cell disease, it's caused by 2 recessive traits, so 2 little letters, but carriers can still have one recessive trait and they can actually display some of the symptoms. They will have some misshapen red blood cells, but they will not actually have the disease. So guys, red blood cells should be like a disc shape, circular shape, but in sickle cell, they're more moon shaped, kind of like a half moon or what we'd call a sickle. The sickle cell trait, you need 2 recessive to have the complete disease, but carriers can have some of the symptoms. Carriers, though, have an advantage against malaria. Now, guys, sickle cell is actually more common in individuals who have African American descent, like so African descent, or Mediterranean descent. Now, there's a reason for this. In that area of Africa and the Mediterranean, they have mosquitoes who carry malaria. And in some of those countries, malaria is a death sentence because they don't have modern treatment for it. And so individuals who carry the trait but don't actually have sickle cell, they have an advantage against malaria. Malaria doesn't like to infect them. Okay, the plasmodium that causes malaria doesn't like them. And so it gives them an advantage. The problem is if 2 individuals who carry the sickle cell trait get together, there's a 25% chance that they have a child who has sickle cell. And in those same countries where medical treatment's not available for malaria, medical treatment's not available for sickle cell. And sickle cell life expectancy without any kind of treatment or medication is not very good. Okay. The reason being is because they are sickle shaped. They get caught up in the organs, causing clots, and they can cause organ failure if it's not watched properly. And so there's a lot of different things that could happen. They also become more anemic. They're tired. There's a lot of different traits that come into play. All right. But being a carrier can be an advantage in some of those countries, especially in Africa or the Mediterranean areas where malaria is more prevalent. The last thing in these notes, guys, is we talked a little bit about this in another video, but polygenic disorders are those that are environmentally influenced, and this means they're what we consider multifactorial. So cleft lip and palate is shown here. It's where the palate, where the two bones in the top of your roof of your mouth should fuse together, and they don't. And it leaves a hole between the cavity of your mouth and your nose. It could also cause the lip to not form completely. So that's a cleft lip. You can have a cleft palate without a cleft lip. But these guys can actually be surgically fixed. There are individuals who survive and learn how to eat and that function just fine with the cleft lip and palate. It's more of a cosmetic thing by that point. But in babies, a lot of times if we can get it fixed earlier, it's going to help them thrive better because this does cause feeding issues when sucking on a bottle or breastfeeding. Clubfoot is normally due to position in the womb, where while they're developing, the foot develops where it is curled up. Again, this can be surgically fixed. We also see hip dysplasia. Hip dysplasia is where the hips dislocate too easily. And a lot of times, again, this can be harness, where they put a harness on there or cast up the hips to help with that, to where later it doesn't cause as much of a problem. Also, hypertension, high blood pressure could be affected by the environment, multifactorial. This is more when you get older. Allergies could also be multifactorial. You might be more prone to them. However, you may get more based on where you live. Cancer is another one. Diabetes. Some individuals have a family history of it, but it also can be based on the diet and what you eat as well. And then, like we said, schizophrenia, alcoholism, and phobias, there is a slight genetic component to it, but we don't know if it's more advanced, okay? There's a lot of research out there to try to look at whether that's true, but a lot of those, schizophrenia, alcoholism, and phobias, tend to also be highly controlled by the environment as well, even probably more so than some of the others. All right. But again, there's more studies to see if there is a higher genetic base, because we do find individuals who suffer from schizophrenia, their kids suffer from it at higher rates. So there's got to be some sort of genetic component that's there. But like I said, further studies are being done to look into those. Okay. But phobias, you might have a kind of built-in phobia for certain things, but we can overcome those phobias a lot of times, or we can develop more phobias. One example is my daughters. They didn't have a big issue with spiders or creepy crawly type bugs and things like that until my husband made a big deal about it. He's very scared of those things, whereas they weren't, and he would scare them, be like, don't touch that, it could be poisonous, or don't touch that, it could hurt you or bite you. And so now they have this fear of those things that they didn't have before. Now, there is a difference between having a healthy fear and a phobia, but that could lead to a potential phobia based on some environmental things and some of the experiences that a person has gone through in their life that could cause them to have more of a phobia than just a fear. Okay. And so it's difficult to know for sure. But again, like I said, studies are being done to look more into that. Now, this kind of finishes up the human genetic disorders. Of course, there's a whole lot more than what we talked about, but I just wanted to hit on a few of them, give you a little bit better idea. But like I said, if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know.